This week, so last week we talked a lot about establishment, and we visited about vegetative versus seed and all of that stuff that went on. We're going to transition now into some of the maintenance activities that we do. And the first one we're going to talk about is mowing. But to get us started off, I want you guys to do 3 of you in a group, 3 of you as a group, and actually, Thomas, why don't you work with them, and Brandon, why don't you come up here with this group. So get together in a group, and I want you to come up with a list of all of the ways that mowing impacts a stand of turf. All right, so when we mow grass, and think about it, I mean, if we've talked about different ways that we can manipulate mowing, right? We can change the height, we can change the frequency. There's a lot of different things we can do to manipulate the act of mowing as a cultural practice. But I want you to brainstorm a list of the way that mowing can impact that plant or that turf grass system, okay? So it can be really fine details that are down to the individual plant, or it could be something that encompasses that entire plant community. All right? So think about ways that mowing impacts a stand of turf. And I'll give you just 4 or 5 minutes, come up with a short list here, and then we'll put them on the board and talk through them.
What do you mean, like, you're not, like, constantly spraying with fungicide, like you are with all the roses, like... Yeah, but you work with kind of people that you lab. That's all they're going to send in is, like... They're not going to send in healthy plants. They're just a little they just think it's probably a nutrient deficiency. I feel like how they can affect what? Like the makeup here. But it's probably not very. Yeah.
I did this morning. Yeah.
I tried to look at it this morning, but
Sorry about that.
No, that's
yeah, it's unlocked.
I just wanted to check.
Also, is it going to always be 1 module a week, or is it like, because sometimes it's 2, I think.
There's a couple of them where there's a couple modules a week, but
The first couple ones, it
yeah.
was like 2 so far.
Most of the rest of it's this week's 1.
Oh, okay.
I think the rest of them are all
These are all. I think it's all 1 the rest of the way out. It was just the first or second week. First and second week they had a couple. Yeah.
This one, please.
All right. You guys have your list pulled together? Huh? Sort of, kind of, maybe? All right, so mowing. How does mowing impact a stand of turf?
It makes it better to set forth the disease.
All right. What else? Mark?
It reduces spread.
All right, what else?
Cross-contamination of weeds and seeds.
I'm just gonna put contamination because we'll get into that. What else?
It encourages root growth. Height has a lot of different factors to it.
Right, so I'm gonna put impact on roots. Okay? Because the act of mowing itself is a stress that may be viewed as a negative on root growth. Because if you start, anything that you start to lower that height of cut, it's going to have a negative impact on roots. But it does. We'll talk about some of that in 2. What else?
Either like recycle nutrients in the soil.
All right. So source. Of nutrients, right? Or shade canopy. All right. What else?
We're using a large machine to mow and cause soil impact.
Is it a question or a statement? It is. Absolutely. So compaction. What else? Yeah, Mark. Erosion and temperature. Mowing. How is mowing impacting the temperature of the canopy?
If you mow too much, there's less evapotranspiration because there's less leaves, so it can warm up.
We'll put it up here, but we'll explore this maybe. Interesting. I think that in an extreme case, maybe.
Okay.
All right. What else? Oh,
Control the
weeds. All right. Sure. Aesthetics, right? Are we missing anything?
You mentioned about the, you talked like verticutting and stuff like that.
So it's kind of along the lines of, I think, playing off of what Thomas was saying, but with this, what is a function of the aesthetics? When you look at the stand of turf, what components come into your evaluation of whether it looks good or not?
consistency.
So, and it's getting to your point, Libby. So, seed heads. Seed heads are, for most of our grasses, they're not a problem. Bahia grass is an example where seed heads can be a real problem, right? And so we end up having to mow them to keep the seed heads down. You mentioned verticutting and the spreading of the grass, but what is that tying back to that's an aesthetic quality of the turf?
Keeping it where you want to keep it. Like instead of letting it
So verticutting itself is not the same as edging. Edging would be
more dense.
density. So so density of the canopy. Density is a big one, right? Are we missing anything? I'm going to look at this and we'll I'm going to put quality of cut under aesthetics as well to remind myself of something here. Let's start with this as at least a point to lead off with our discussion. So disease. How can mowing have an impact on disease of turf? And I'll tell you, I'll give you a hint. It comes back to this in many cases. Absolutely, I would agree with you that if you're cutting too low, so let's say with, I'm gonna put it over here, so optimum height of cut is a factor to consider. What's going to determine the optimum height of cut? Okay.
I was going to say like the species and whether it might be shape or something.
So the environment that it's growing in can have an impact, absolutely. You know, which is we did discuss that if you're growing a plant under shaded conditions, what do we often recommend for a height of cut?
Higher.
A little bit higher, right? So that you've got more photosynthetic activity, more tissue there for photosynthesis. Species, how does species play a role? You mentioned the species is a function of height, and it's kind of related to their physical characteristics, right? So if you look at the Bermuda grasses versus St. Augustine grass, you've got much wider, longer leaf blades on St. Augustine grass than you typically would see on Bermuda grass. You've got longer internodes. All of that comes together and it makes it very difficult for that plant to succeed under really low heights of cut, where Bermuda grass, particularly with some of the cultivars that we use on putting greens, have very, very short leaf blades when it's mature, very narrow leaf blades, very short internode lengths. And so it really is a compact growth habit that can survive under those extreme conditions of being mowed at like 1/10 of an inch. So the physical characteristics of the plant allow it to handle that. So optimum height of cut, this is going to be dependent on the environmental conditions and I'm going to say species or cultivar, because even within the grasses, we've got hybrid Bermuda grasses like TFWA 419 that you cannot maintain at a putting green height. But you've got things like Tiff Eagle that you can mow at 1/10 of an inch. 419, you start to get below 1/2 an inch and it's going to start to struggle. So there's a cultivar difference in addition to the species difference. And even St. Augustine grass is the same. We've got some dwarf St. Augustine grasses. Captiva was a grass that was released by the University of Florida several years ago, and it never really would grow much more than about 2 inches in height. If you weren't mowing it around 1.5 inches or 2 inches, you were not cutting any tissue off. And that's in pretty stark contrast to Floratam, which has been one of the standards in the industry. And really, Floratam is going to be the healthiest if it's at 4.5 inches in height. If you start getting it down to 2.5 or 3 inches, you might be able to maintain it for a while, but it's going to suffer. So there's some big cultivar differences between the grasses. So disease, the height and environment that it's growing in. Another thing that plays a big role is the way you maintain your mowing equipment. So what is mowing? The physical act of mowing is a physical stress. It damages the leaf tissue, right? You're cutting the leaves off, exposing the vascular system of the plant. And that's a direct conduit where pathogens can get into the plant. So having a sharp if you're talking about a rotary mower, and sharp and well adjusted if you're talking about a reel mower, is really important and critical to having a high quality of cut. Now, the difference between a reel mower and a rotary mower is pretty drastic when you look at the way that they cut the grass. Because a reel mower, you've got that bed knife that's underneath the mower and that cylinder of blades that's spinning. And they're spinning either just barely contacting, in some cases it's just barely contacting the bed knife, just enough that you can hear it. But what happens if metal against metal is put under pressure and high speed? It gets hot, right? So it's just just barely touching the bed knife so that you don't have that heat buildup. But that's the way some manufacturers recommend it. Other manufacturers, it's a no contact grind, but it's just, basically if you got it down in contact, had you contact with the reel and the bed knife and backed it off like 1/1000 of an inch, it's just not touching, but still close enough that when a leaf gets in between there, it cuts it like a pair of scissors. A rotary mower, alternatively though, that's a case where you've got that blade. It's probably what you've seen, maybe you've used it on your home lawn or something like that, but it's a horizontal blade spinning underneath an engine. And that cutting action is just an impact force, right? You've got a sharpened edge, hopefully, spinning at a high rate of speed. And when it comes in contact with the leaf, you hope that the velocity of that blade and the sharpness of the blade is enough to cut the leaf off. Now, if that blade is not maintained and starts to get dull, and right now that zero-turn mower that we've got over at the Envirotron needs to have its blades replaced. The blades are rounded off. We mow outside the facility and run sand through it and everything else, and it just rounds the edge of the blade off. Well, when you cut a leaf with that, you mow with it, it'll still cut the leaf tissue off, but instead of getting a nice, if this is your leaf blade, and you come through with the mower, if it's sharp, you get a nice clean cut. And there'll be just a little, if you come back a few hours later, there'll just be a little tiny bit of necrosis, a little tiny bit of dead tissue right at the edge, right at the end of the leaf tip, if it's a sharp rotary mower, okay? If it's a sharp reel mower, same thing, but even less. It'll be just a very nice clean cut. And a little tiny bit of necrosis at the end where you've damaged those cells, all right? But when it's a dull rotary mower, this damage can extend way down into the leaf blade, and it'll be shredded because it's basically just tearing those leaves off. And that, you often see it when people who maintain their own lawns and they don't mow the blades. You'll go out there, they'll mow it, and in an instant, basically, 3 or 4 hours later, the lawn turns brown. Because it's all you're seeing are the top 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch of the leaf blades that have been shredded by the mower because the mower's dull. Now over the next week to 10 days, it'll grow back out of it for a little bit, but that's a tremendous amount of stress on the plant to take, what's probably already being mowed too short, because it's, often homeowners have a tendency to mow too short. And then you're going to shred the top 1/4 inch of that blade or a little bit more and put it under more stress. So a sharp mower is really important to minimizing that damage, which then is going to minimize the opportunity for pathogens to get into the vascular system. So it plays a role there. Reduces photosynthesis. I think we've talked about that enough along the way that the height of that canopy and the density of that canopy is really important for the plant's ability to produce carbohydrates. We mentioned that in relation to both shade or just the adaptation of those plants for height of cut. So within a species and within a cultivar, there's an adaptable range for height of cut, and you'll see some of that, mention of that in the textbook. There'll be a range from maybe, on the hybrid Bermuda grasses, it might be for a fairy grass, 1/2 inch to 1 inch height of cut is okay. Flortame St. Augustine grass, anywhere from 3 to 4 or 4.5 inches is acceptable. It'll work. On the low end of that, you're going to have to mow more frequently. On the high end of that, you may be able to mow less frequently. All of that playing back into a seasonal impact too of how fast is the grass growing. If it's hot and humid and it's been fertilized and it's ideal growing conditions, you may have to mow twice a week to not put that plant under any undue stress. How often do people mow twice a week? Rarely. So, it's there's a balance there between what's realistic and feasible versus what might be ideal. And in residential landscapes, we often err towards what's feasible. If you're paying somebody to maintain a lawn under a contract as a landscape management company, they're probably going to tell you a certain number, you're going to sign on for a certain number of mowing events a year. And that they'll balance those out. You might, I mean, if it's 52 mowing events a year, then you may not see them at all in, they may not show up at all in November and December, or December and January, whatever the case might be, depending on where you're at. But they may have it built in that they show up 2 times a week for parts of July and August, because they decide that that's how they want to use their time. Often what you'll see though is maybe 30 or 40 mowing events a year, and those are of course spaced maybe weekly in the middle of the summer and very sparsely throughout the fall and winter months. Contamination. So you mentioned, I think Bo, was this yours? Yeah, so contamination, you mentioned weeds, disease. I don't know if you mentioned disease, but disease is absolutely a concern from a contamination standpoint with mowing. We're seeing that actually take place down in the Tampa and Sarasota area with the sugarcane mosaic virus that is a fairly new pathogen for St. Augustine grass. They suspect that most of the transmission of that is happening through mowers. That a mower is going across a contaminated yard and then moving to the next yard without sanitizing and cleaning it out and transferring some of that pathogen to other yards. So mowing can be both a problem from disease, and it can be an issue with weeds and also contamination with other grasses. Now, how many of you've operated push mowers? It's not always quite as obvious, but it frequently can happen with like zero turns and other larger mowers, where you'll get plant material that builds up on the deck, from when you're mowing, and that could be stolons, could be seed heads. But if you take that mower and you finish up on this piece of property and you promptly load it into the back of a trailer, move to the next one that's a couple miles down the road, and get out and start mowing that, and for whatever reason some of that plant material falls off, there's a chance you could be contaminating with other grasses. Maybe you were mowing Bermuda grass before, and now you're in somebody's St. Augustine grass lawn, and you end up dropping some Bermuda grass stolons, or maybe common Bermuda grass seed, and it gets a chance to germinate, and you've contaminated it with another turf. So that can happen, absolutely. On golf courses, Pythium is a really, really problematic disease of golf courses, particularly golf course putting greens. It's more of an issue in cool season grasses, like you get up in the Midwest where it can be really hot and humid in the summer. Pythium is a fungal pathogen that it lacks cell walls. The hyphae grow very, very quickly. They don't have any cell walls, and they can spread rapidly through the canopy. And it spreads both in water, so if water is running and starts to run off downhill, you'll see the pathogen move with the water, but it absolutely moves with mowers as well. And you can see, there's cases where you have a breakout. It might break out on one particular putting green where the disease started, but then because of the track of the mowers, they know that they started, maybe they started to number 1 putting green and they moved through the 18. If the disease broke out on this really protected area of number 7, where maybe there's little air movement, ideal conditions for fungal development, the mower goes through it and then spreads it on to the next 2 or 3 greens that they have to mow. So contamination is a real problem. Impact on roots. In the PowerPoint, you're going to see a discussion, and we've talked about it a little bit if I remember right, this relationship between mowing height and root depth. As you decrease height of cut, your root system is going to decline. Okay? Now, mowing frequency, and I think you were talking a little bit about, maybe it was about mowing frequency too. If you mow too infrequent, so you're not mowing frequently enough, there can be a negative impact on root growth, even if you're at the ideal height of cut, because you're going to have this. The plant is going to produce new vegetative tissue and get up to however high you let it to get before you come in and try to hack it back down again. It's going to grow new roots to support that vegetative tissue, and then when you come back and chop it back off down to where you want it to be, it no longer needs those roots that it's grown deeper down the profile, and it starts to slough them off. So it expends carbohydrates to grow those new roots, and it ultimately puts those plants under stress. If you either mow too frequently or if you mow too low, for what it's adapted. Even with an adapted range, as you go lower, you will see a decrease in root depth.
Can that cause like root rot of the roots that the plant doesn't need anymore, or?
That's a good question. That I don't know if anyone has looked specifically at the relationship between, like if you mow it and scalp it back and you end up sloughing off a bunch of those roots. I don't know if there's a direct relationship there between like Rhizoctonia or some other root pathogen. Certainly, I could certainly see that you might put it under stress, but I think that there's going to be other factors that would lead to those types of root pathogens that would be sort of independent of that. Clippings, it is true, the group back here in the center, clippings by weight have about 3% nitrogen by weight. That's pretty much any plant, right? We take the leaves off of one of these trees out here, dry them down, grind them up, analyze them, and we're going to find phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, all the essential plant nutrients, right? All of them in any plant leaf that's actively growing. Now, some of those can be released and be made back available for the plants to grow with and take up and use. Some of them more easily than others, right? But as that organic matter is returned back to the canopy through mowing, those clippings will break down, and that nitrogen and other stuff, phosphorus, potassium, whatever can be in there, but typically we look at it from the standpoint of that nitrogen contribution. You do contribute nitrogen back to the system. Now, what it equates to over the season of over a growing season, it's roughly a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. It's maybe one fertilizer application, maybe, but rarely do you see it actually be accounted for in a change in fertility. It is certainly contributing to it. I think more importantly from my standpoint, the more important thing to recognize about clipping management, particularly from the standpoint of nutrients, is the fact that they do include nutrients, right? So if we mow a yard and we blow those clippings into the sidewalk or the driveway or the street, and we don't clean them back up, we might as well have taken the fertilizer spreader and spread fertilizer in the street. Because that organic matter is going to break down, the phosphorus and nitrogen in there is going to be made available, and when those clippings, rain comes, whatever happens, they end up down in the storm water system, you're going to be contributing nutrients to a surface body of water somewhere. So those clippings need to be managed and maintained much like we do fertilizer. Keep them off of impervious surfaces because they do serve as a source of nutrients, and they should be kept back in the canopy. So blow off or sweep the clippings off of driveways and sidewalks and streets, just back into the canopy. You don't have to pick them up. In fact, we don't even recommend bagging clippings when you mow. Why don't we recommend bagging clippings when you mow?
What are you going to do with them?
They're going to end up in a landfill, right? In most cases. I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, we had 3 or 4 head of cattle in a pasture right next to the yard. I'd bag them, dump the grass over the fence, and the cows would eat the grass that I dumped over there. So maybe that was serving a purpose. But often, I mean, my mom, as many times as I've told her she doesn't need to bag the clippings, she still bags them, puts them in the back of her truck, drives to the landfill, and dumps them in the landfill. I've told her, I don't know how many times, but that's just the way she wants to do it. There's a school of thought that the clippings contribute to thatch. It doesn't. They don't. They break down very quickly. The things that contribute to thatch are the stolons and rhizomes. Those break down much more slowly than the clippings. The clippings are going to break down, and you won't even see them there after a period of time. The exception is when like we talked about out here outside the classroom, is if the grass has gotten too tall between mowing events, and now there's just piles of clippings after you mow, and it's going to shade out the canopy below it. Now you've got a couple options that you might be able to use to manage that. One of them, like I mentioned, is to come back and mow that same site again immediately in a different direction and run those clippings through the deck another time and spread them out in a different way, and you might get them spread out enough that they're not really going to be a problem. For most residential, commercial type landscapes, that's probably going to be sufficient. We Return clippings pretty much in every situation with the exception of golf course putting greens. Why don't we return clippings on golf course putting greens?
Probably because the grass is so short anyway, the clippings would affect like the function of the turf.
Yeah, it's purely from a function standpoint because of your point. The ball rolls across that surface, and if you have any sort of little clumps of clippings on there, they would impact the ball roll. So it's purely a function standpoint. I mean, there's no agronomic reason not to do it. It's a use issue. On athletic fields, the only time that I see anybody really bag clippings, you know, sometimes they'll bag clippings off of Florida field after a game if there's been a lot of that tufting that I described, you know, where the leaves and stems are sticking up, and they're concerned about, you know, the buildup of that, basically piles of clippings in different places. They'll put the baskets on and collect them and remove them after the game, but the rest of the time they're just mowing them back into the canopy. Compaction. If you've lived in or visited a homeowners association where all the yards, and maybe all the front yards, are maintained by the same landscape management company, and they mow them all with the same zero-turn mower every week, all year long, for years, you will often see the wheel tracks of those mowers through the grass. If you pay attention, if you go through neighborhoods where there is a home, you know, where it's like everything looks a little bit Stepford Wives sort of thing, you know, everything's perfect and manicured and looks exactly the same. They're probably being maintained, managed by the same landscape company. Look for the wheel tracks. You often can see it, particularly in St. Augustine grass, because where that compaction has occurred from the wheel tracks of the mowers, the grass changes its growth habit a little bit. Instead of the St. Augustine grass being, you know, having vertical leaves, it'll be a little bit more prostrate. It'll just look different where those wheel tracks are. And I've seen it in numerous examples where that compaction can have an impact on the aesthetics ultimately of that stand of turf. Now, that can be managed if you put some effort into it. But when a company is hired to come in and mow 90, 100, 200 yards all at once, and they're all side by side for blocks on end, what's the most efficient way to do that? Start at one end and go down the sidewalk all the way to the other, right? So the easiest way to do it, now to break that up would require, rather than one real long stretch, which you can do all at once, would require doing each yard individually and maybe changing the direction that you mow. And that then takes more time. I was visiting I used to live in Jonesville in a subdivision called Belmont. And there was a company here in town that had the landscape management contract for the front yards. And the contract at that time, this has been 5 or 6 years ago, the contract at that time for the 130 yards or so that were in that subdivision was about $90,000 a year. And I was visiting with him about how, you know, that worked out, and he said that ultimately he had about $8 or $9 per mowing event that he could allocate to each individual yard. The way that the pricing of the contract worked out, I mean, it was basically they had to get in there and out as quickly as possible, because anything that extended that time at all would start to have a negative impact on what made that contract have any chance of being profitable. And it's such a competitive industry that, you know, every little edge that you can to make yourself competitive in terms of the time and labor that goes into it, labor being one of the biggest expenses, is going to make the difference between you having a chance of being successful or not. Temperature, Mark, you mentioned temperature, right? I agree that if you scalp back significantly, much lower than your optimal height of cut, that you could have a resulting increase in canopy temperature. So I think that is something that could happen. The long-term impact on that from a turf quality standpoint, I don't know whether there would be, if that stress would be have as much of an impact as the act of scalping it back, right? Where you're gonna remove a bunch of that photosynthetic material, put a lot of stress on that from a carbohydrate standpoint in terms of having to exhaust carbohydrates to produce new leaves. I'm not sure that temperature piece would be as important as the scalping of it itself. This is a huge one, weeds. So, this group back here that's mentioned weeds, right? You mentioned weeds that may not tolerate mowing, right? So there are some weeds, particularly if you look at long fence lines and things that have their apical meristem up at the top of the plant, like a tomato, right? If you come in and mow a tomato off at 4 inches, is it going to grow back? And there might be a couple buds that break, but essentially you're going to kill the plant, right? If that plant has more of a prostrate growth habit, it might survive mowing for a period of time, okay? So mowing for some plants, these that when we think of them like as pasture weeds, things that are going to grow vertically and have the apical meristem up at the top of the plant, mowing is a great way to control those. And with just regular frequent mowing, you'll have very few problems with that. The problem that we have, though, that mowing directly as a cutting action can't control are the ones that grow low to the ground. Can mowing impact those, though?
Yeah.
Generally, we're saying yes. Now, why might it have an impact on those plants? So we've got perennial plants, right? There's perennial plants, there's annual plants. And then we can get even more specifically and look at the annuals and say that whether they're summer annuals or winter annuals that are weeds in turf, right? So perennial plants, that could be Bermuda grass growing in a St. Augustine grass lawn. Mowing probably is not going to do a whole lot to help you out in that situation because the Bermuda grass can tolerate a much lower height of cut than the St. Augustine can. If you tried to do anything with mowing that would put that Bermuda grass under stress, you would completely annihilate your St. Augustine grass. So mowing's not going to do a lot to help you there. But and that's a perennial grassy weed. But what if we're dealing with annual grassy weeds or even annual broadleaf weeds that need light to germinate? Well, not necessarily to germinate, but to start producing photosynthesis and to grow. And we have a turfgrass canopy that we're maintaining on the lower end of that adaptable height of cut, the range. Maybe it's got a little bit more of an open canopy as a result. We're making it much easier for those weeds to gain hold and take a hold in that landscape. Alternatively, if we have a really dense canopy, both as a result of the mowing that we do and the fertilizer and pest and disease control that we put into place, but mowing having a big impact here of mowing at kind of mid-range or high end of the optimal range, we're going to have a much higher density and make it much more difficult for weeds to have a chance to take hold. So mowing can have a huge impact on weed populations, both from the standpoint of those, like you mentioned originally, that are not adapted to mowing, but also the ones that need to germinate from seed on an annual basis. If they can't get enough light to grow, they can't get through that canopy because it's dense and being maintained properly, you're going to have lower weed pressure. Aesthetics, both density and quality of cut. We talked about quality of cut, I think, enough to address that. But what about density? How does mowing impact density?
Makes it bigger.
If I mow once a year, is it going to make it thicker? No. So there's a function of frequency and height of cut that comes into play, right? So if you take any one grass and you mow it at the optimum height of cut, and you never let it get too tall between mowings. Remember, we've got that 1/3 rule that you don't let it get you never remove more than about 30% of the leaf tissue at one time. Good rule to follow. I don't see very many people going out with calipers to figure out how high their grass is and deciding. But I mean, generally speaking, you don't want it to get real tall and then scalp it back off. So your mowing frequency is going to be a function of the rate of growth. It really should play a role. I mean, as we get into October and November and the temperatures start to drop, I'm not going to be mowing my St. Augustine grass every week because the grass is not going to be growing as fast. So I don't need to mow it every week. But in late June through end of September, there's a few times where I probably should mow it twice a week because it's growing so rapidly. I mean, even you look at it from a distance and it looks like it's fine. You walk through it and it's mid-calf. I mean, it's time to mow it. So the density does absolutely play a role in terms of that frequent mowing, giving that plant the stimulation to produce new stolons if it's St. Augustine grass, but produce new lateral growth, and to keep the leaf density higher. Now we can do other things that also impact the density of that, which we mentioned, I think, in one of the earlier sessions when we talk about verticutting. And we'll talk about some of these practices in a little bit more detail, I think, in this same module. But verticutting, aerifying, but verticutting being one where you get in there and you cut those stolons or rhizomes and induce bud breaks so that you get more stolons and rhizomes to grow laterally and then more leaves to come off of it. So mowing can play a role there, absolutely, in keeping the density higher. Environmental conditions for optimum height to cut, shade or the amount of light that's available can have an impact on that. The season of the year has an impact on it. So if we're going into right now a stressful period for warm season grasses. Why is it going to be a stressful period for warm season grasses? Temperatures are dropping. What else is happening right now?
It's drying now.
Rainfall's going to change. Huh?
The days are getting shorter.
Days are getting shorter. So the amount of sunlight that we have every day is going to get less. In addition, the sun, as we get later in the season, starts to drop on the horizon. It has a lower angle of incidence. So we get lower light intensity as the sun gets lower on the horizon in the fall and winter. So it's both day length and light intensity as a result of the sun's angle. So even if we didn't change anything, because of the lower temperatures, because of the reduced light intensity that we're going to experience in the fall, we would want to raise the height of cut a little bit. It might only be a half inch maybe on a residential landscape, but that little bit of a half inch can give you just a little bit of extra to make that grass competitive going into the fall and to produce more carbohydrates to store. On a putting green, it might be just raising it a 1/16 of an inch or a 32nd of an inch. 30 seconds of an inch on a putting green that's being maintained at an 1/8 of an inch is like a 30 or 40% increase in photosynthetic tissue. It's a huge impact. So you don't have to make very big changes to have a potential to have a big impact on the plant in those more stressful conditions. If we're talking about a cool season grass, a C3 grass like Kentucky bluegrass or perennial ryegrass, when's the stressful time of the year for those grasses? Summer. When we get into, now it's the opposite, right? We get into June, first part of July, through most of the country where the daytime temperatures are now getting up into the 90s. Through the Midwest, the nighttime temperatures might not get down below the 70s or 80s. It's a really stressful period for those cool season grasses. Another time where raising that height to cut a little bit could be beneficial, just from the environmental conditions, so that you have the plant producing more carbohydrates. Questions?
Do we have a field trip Wednesday?
So Wednesday, yes, we'll meet here. Class starts at whatever 9:30, 9:35, but we'll meet. I will have the van probably parked. I'm going to have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12. We might all be able to fit in one van with who's here. If we can, we'll just take I've got a 15-passenger van that I'm renting, so if we can, we'll just take the one van down. If we have to, Brianna will be here as well. If we have to, we'll grab a state truck and go down with that as well, or one of the state vehicles. But we'll have the vehicles, vehicles just right out here. Just meet out here by the side of the greenhouse, and we'll load up. We're going to go down to the plant science unit in Citra and take a look at the turf grass plots down there. Maybe look briefly at some of the equipment that they've got, and then we'll make sure we're back here before 12:30, which would be the scheduled time for this class to end, so that if you've got a course after this, that you'll be able to get to it. Okay, but count on it taking most of that 3-hour period. You need a memo.
I'm just asking, are we leaving at 9:35 or earlier?
No, we won't leave any earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, I won't leave.
Okay. Well, then maybe I may not leave a note. I can just email the professor and say I have to leave maybe like 10, 15 minutes early.
That's fine.
Yeah, that might work.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not gonna. No, it would probably be 9:40, 9 whatever by the time we get out of here. So.
I probably won't do that then.
But we'll leave as promptly as we can
Right.
with the start of the class period. But no, I'm not going to ask you to be here any earlier than what the class period normally starts. Where comfortable shoes will be walking, rain or shine will go down, but rain may change a little bit about what we do. That'll be the plan at the moment. I don't think it's supposed to rain.
So in general, like, with height of putt, like, you want to raise it if it's stressed.
Right. The act of mowing is a stress, but mowing as a cultural practice, this is probably one of the most important things we do managing a turf, because it has so much potential either to go wrong or to have basically a net benefit in terms of what we want out of that plant in terms of density and canopy characteristics. So, you can have a big impact on weed populations. You can have a big impact on disease pressure by mowing properly and maintaining your equipment properly.
Thank you.
Yep.